The sun hung low over the Pacific horizon, casting a warm amber hue across the coastal skyline. Grace Carter, a poised woman in her early 50s with radiant brown skin and a calm presence, stepped out of a town car and into the marbled lobby of the Ocean View Peninsula Resort. Her dress was simple, a beige A-line cotton blend that reached just below her knees, and her shoes were practical flats. A small leather handbag hung from her shoulder. Compared to the guests floating through the lobby in designer gowns and glittering jewels, she looked undeniably understated. Grace wasn't there to impress. She was there on business, her business. As founder of the Carter Foundation, she had spent the past month organizing a high-profile charity gala at this very resort, designed to raise scholarship funds for underserved youth. Just an hour earlier, she had been at a local boutique downtown, reviewing donated items for the evening's silent auction. Instead of returning home to change, she came straight to the resort to check on the final setup. As she approached the check-in desk, she gave the receptionist a warm smile. "Hi there. I'm here to confirm arrangements for tonight's Carter Foundation Gala." The young receptionist's expression faltered as she glanced at Grace's attire. Her eyes flitted to a computer screen, then back to Grace. "Are you staff for one of the guests?" Grace's smile didn't waver. "No, I'm attending the gala. Actually, I'm the founder of the Carter Foundation." The girl blinked, clearly uncertain, and began typing into the computer. I don't see your name here. Are you sure it's under Carter?" "Jonathan Carter is my husband," Grace said calmly. "He should have called ahead. He's arriving later today, by yacht." Just then, a man in a tailored navy suit approached. His name tag read Richard Wallace, General Manager. His tone was polite, but his smile held no warmth. "Is there a problem here?" The receptionist leaned in and whispered something. Richard's expression shifted slightly as he scanned Grace from head to toe. "Ma'am, this is a private resort, and the Carter Gala is an exclusive event." "I think there may be a misunderstanding," he said. Grace tried again, steady as ever. "There's no misunderstanding. I'm Grace Carter." But Richard's skepticism only deepened. "With all due respect, Mrs. Carter wouldn't arrive unescorted, dressed like this." Grace reached into her bag for her ID, but Richard waved dismissively. "Anyone can print an ID these days. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave." There was no scene. No shouting. No anger. Grace nodded gently and asked, "May I use the restroom before I go?" He granted her that small dignity, but as she walked away, she overheard him mutter to a guard, "Make sure she's gone. These types don't give up easy." What he didn't know was this: in exactly 2 hours, his world was about to shift, and Grace Carter would be at the center of it. The restroom's marble interior was quiet, polished to perfection, with the subtle scent of lavender in the air. Grace Carter entered calmly, her posture unshaken. Locking the stall behind her, she pulled out her phone. With the ease of someone who had done this before, she tapped a few keys and sent a brief message to her assistant, Vanessa Brooks. Code Cinderella. Ocean View Peninsula. 2 hours. The reply came within seconds. Understood. Executing protocol. Grace allowed herself the hint of a smile. She and her husband, Jonathan Carter, had come up with this discreet code after too many similar incidents. The world had often judged Grace by her appearance, her modest clothing, her quiet demeanor, and, yes, even the color of her skin. But instead of confronting ignorance with anger, Grace preferred to let people reveal their own character. Then, she responded in kind, with grace and precision. She slipped her phone back into her purse and exited the restroom with the same steady confidence she had entered with. But waiting just outside were two security guards, arms folded across their chests, summoned by Richard Wallace's whispered instructions. "Miss, whatever your name really is," the taller one said with a smirk, "Mr. Wallace asked us to escort you off the property immediately." Grace nodded without protest. "Of course," she replied, her voice smooth and composed. As they crossed the elegant grand lobby, curious eyes followed. Conversations hushed. Some guests turned their heads, others whispered behind well-manicured hands. A few pulled out their phones, subtly recording. The sight of a woman like Grace, modestly dressed, escorted out by security, made people assume the worst. Richard Wallace stepped out from behind the front desk, watching her exit with a satisfied gleam in his eye. "Perhaps next time," he called out loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, "you'll book a reservation under your own name. We only host the Carter Gala out of respect for Mr. Carter's generosity. His wife is known for her elegance, something not everyone can claim." Laughter rippled among the nearby guests. Grace did not react. She didn't lower her eyes or quicken her steps. Her back remained straight, her chin lifted. As they reached the front entrance, one of the guards asked, his tone tinged with condescension, "Want us to call you a cab?" She turned slightly, smiled softly. "No, thank you. I'll manage." And with that, Grace stepped out into the golden afternoon sun, the warm breeze rustling gently through the palm trees. She walked unhurriedly down the resort's curved driveway, her silhouette framed against the ocean beyond. She didn't need to argue. She didn't need to prove anything. Because in less than 2 hours, the same people who had laughed would be scrambling to apologize. And Richard Wallace? He'd soon discover just how costly a snap judgment could be. Grace Carter strolled along the coastal promenade that traced the edge of the Ocean View Peninsula Resort. Though recently humiliated and escorted off the property, she walked with poise, her steps measured and steady. To the casual observer, she looked like any other elegant local enjoying the sea breeze. But inside, a quiet fire had been lit, and the match had already been struck. She found a shaded table at a small cafe with a perfect view of the marina, ordered an iced tea with lemon, and took a seat. Her fingers, still calm, wrapped around the cool glass as her eyes moved to the harbor in the distance. Seagulls floated lazily overhead. A pelican dove and came up with a fish. Tourists chatted nearby, unaware of the quiet storm brewing. She glanced at her watch, an understated vintage piece that once belonged to her father, a mechanic from Dayton, Ohio. It was 2:20 p.m. That gave her just under an hour and 40 minutes. The message from Vanessa had arrived minutes earlier. "Jonathan is furious. ETA, 100 minutes. Package arrives in 20. Perfect timing." This wasn't the first time Grace had been dismissed or underestimated. Before marrying Jonathan Carter, now one of the wealthiest black entrepreneurs in the country, she'd put herself through college with scholarships, night shifts, and sheer grit. She had learned early that dignity wasn't something granted. It was something carried, no matter the room, no matter the company. Her phone buzzed again. A sleek black car pulled up outside the cafe. Angela Rivers, her trusted driver, stepped out in a crisp black uniform. She scanned the patio and locked eyes with Grace. "Mrs. Carter?" Angela said quietly as she approached, carrying a garment bag and small suitcase. "Yes, Angela." "Right on time," Grace replied with a warm smile. "Ms. Brooks said you might need these urgently. Everything's been pressed and prepared. Are you all right?" "Just a small misunderstanding that'll clear up shortly," Grace said, her tone calm but deliberate. "Jonathan's handling the rest." Angela smiled knowingly. Everyone who knew Jonathan Carter understood that when his wife was slighted, he didn't send emails. He arrived. And when he arrived, people paid attention. Grace accepted the bags, offered Angela a generous tip, and thanked her for the prompt service. Then, carrying the packages into the cafe's restroom, she began to transform. 20 minutes later, Grace Carter emerged anew. Her simple dress had been replaced with an elegant cream sheath, tailored perfectly to her figure. Her natural curls now flowed in soft waves, and a delicate diamond necklace, a gift from Jonathan on their first anniversary, graced her neck. She looked like the powerful woman the resort hadn't bothered to recognize. As she stepped back onto the promenade, reactions shifted instantly. Heads turned. Strangers smiled. The same world that had ignored her moments earlier now leaned in. Grace took a sip of her tea, smiled to herself, and thought, "Let's see how they treat me now." With the harbor breeze brushing against her cheeks and the scent of salt in the air, Grace Carter walked leisurely along the shoreline path that curved back toward the resort. Her appearance had transformed, yes, but her essence remained unchanged. This wasn't about vanity. It was about clarity. She knew how the world worked, and she had no intention of scolding it. She preferred to outmaneuver it, gracefully. As she approached a quiet bench under a pergola of flowering vines, she sat and dialed a familiar number. On the third ring, a smooth voice answered. "Thomas Blake." "Hi Thomas, it's Grace Carter." Well, he chuckled. "Grace, always a pleasure. Everything all right at my resort?" "I wish I could say yes," she replied gently. "There's been a bit of a situation with your general manager." She gave him a brief, measured account of what had happened, not with bitterness, but with the calm articulation of someone who had learned long ago to separate emotion from action. She emphasized that she wasn't seeking anyone's job, just an opportunity to make sure the lesson landed where it needed to. There was a pause on the line, then Thomas spoke again, his tone serious but admiring. "You know, I could have Richard Wallace out of there by dinner." "I'm sure you could," Grace replied with a soft laugh. "But that would be too easy. I think we have something more meaningful in mind." "Of course you do," he said, amused. "You and Jonathan always preferred a poetic ending." "Not poetic," Grace replied, "just educational." They said their goodbyes, and Grace stood, brushing a stray leaf from her dress. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Jonathan. "Almost there. Are you all right?" She smiled as she typed her reply. "Never better. Richard has no idea what's coming." Just then, she turned to face the ocean and caught her first glimpse of the Odyssey, Jonathan Carter's legendary 300-foot superyacht. Even from this distance, its sleek white profile was unmistakable, a symbol of both power and elegance. The yacht had been custom-built 4 years earlier and had drawn headlines ever since, not just for its amenities, but for the man who captained its legacy. Grace felt no need for revenge. That wasn't her way. What she wanted was impact. She had spent her life building programs to uplift others, not to tear them down. But sometimes, those who judged too quickly needed a mirror held up to their behavior. And there was no better mirror than the one framed in humility and truth. She continued her stroll, each step bringing her closer to the moment the curtain would rise. She wasn't returning to the resort as a wronged guest. She was returning as Grace Carter, philanthropist, wife of a billionaire, and living proof that dignity doesn't shout. It simply arrives, and is felt by everyone in the room. Back at the Ocean View Peninsula Resort, General Manager Richard Wallace stood in the grand ballroom, inspecting the finishing touches for the Carter Foundation Gala. He moved from table to table, adjusting centerpieces and repositioning candles. On the surface, he appeared composed. Inside, though, a growing knot of unease was tightening in his chest. Just moments earlier, he had received an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Wallace, line 1, it's Mr. Blake," the receptionist had said, her voice unsteady. Thomas Blake, the owner of the entire resort chain, rarely called directly. Richard had hurried to his office, straightened his tie, and picked up the receiver with forced enthusiasm. "Mr. Blake. What an honor." But the voice on the other end wasn't there for pleasantries. "Richard, I've just been informed that Jonathan Carter's yacht, the Odyssey, will be docking at our marina within the hour," Thomas said. "He's arriving early. And he's not happy." Richard had gone still. "Is there something wrong?" Thomas's tone grew sharper. He mentioned a misunderstanding involving his wife. "Ring any bells?" Blood drained from Richard's face. His mind raced back to the woman in the beige dress. The one he had dismissed, judged, and personally escorted off the property. "Sir, a woman did come in earlier claiming to be Mrs. Carter, but, well, she didn't look the part. She wasn't dressed like someone of her stature." Silence stretched for several seconds. Then Thomas said firmly, "Have you ever actually met Grace Carter?" "Well, no, sir. But I've seen. She avoids the spotlight for a reason. That woman you humiliated? That was Grace Carter. And she happens to be one of the most influential philanthropists in this state." The call ended with a curt warning to prepare, immediately, for the Carters' arrival. Now, standing in the lobby, Richard felt sweat beading along his collar. He called an emergency staff meeting. "We may have made a serious mistake earlier today. The woman we turned away? That may have been Mrs. Carter. And the Odyssey will dock within 30 minutes. His staff scrambled. Red carpet service was rushed to the marina. Chilled champagne was brought out. Flower arrangements were hauled to the dock. Guests were gently herded into position to create the illusion of a warm welcome. Richard rushed outside just in time to see the Odyssey emerging from the morning mist. Towering at 300 feet, its sleek hull shimmered under the sun, dwarfing every other vessel in the marina. Crew members in pristine uniforms prepared the gangway as onlookers gathered, whispering and pointing. The yacht was more than a symbol of wealth. It was a warning shot, a reminder that appearances could deceive, and that judgment could be costly. Richard straightened his jacket and pasted on a practiced smile, but his heart pounded. He knew what was coming wasn't just a powerful arrival. It was a reckoning. And it would be led not by Jonathan Carter, but by the woman he had turned away. The sun had climbed higher, casting golden rays across the marina as the Odyssey docked with silent elegance. Every eye was fixed on the 300-foot luxury yacht, gleaming like a floating palace. Resort staff stood in rigid formation along the red carpet. Champagne flutes glistened on silver trays. Guests whispered, cell phones at the ready. Richard Wallace stood at the front, nervously adjusting his tie. His practiced hospitality smile now strained, masking the weight of dread pressing down on him. Then, from the top of the gangway, Jonathan Carter appeared. Tall and commanding, with a head of closely cropped silver hair and a sharp navy suit tailored to perfection, Jonathan descended the steps with the slow confidence of a man used to owning every room he entered. His expression gave nothing away, cool, unreadable. Richard stepped forward eagerly, hand extended. "Mr. Carter. Welcome to the Ocean View Peninsula. I'm Richard Wallace, the general manager. It's an honor." Jonathan didn't slow. Didn't even glance at the offered handshake. "Mr. Carter? Richard tried again, hustling to keep pace beside him. I understand there may have been a misunderstanding earlier today. If I could just explain. Jonathan stopped cold. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut glass. That's what you call publicly humiliating my wife? Escorting her off the property like a criminal? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Guests who had been present earlier suddenly made the connection. A few hung their heads, remembering the way they'd smirked or turned their backs on Grace. Before Richard could respond, Jonathan turned and gestured toward the yacht. A hush fell. And then Grace Carter appeared. She stood at the top of the gangway, elegant, radiant, unmistakable. Her cream-colored dress flowed gently in the breeze. Her diamond necklace caught the afternoon sun, glinting with quiet power. But it wasn't the jewelry or the dress that captured the crowd. It was the calm dignity in her gaze. As she descended, heads turned. People parted instinctively, making way. A few even offered quiet apologies under their breath, though Grace acknowledged them with nothing more than a graceful nod. She reached Jonathan's side, and he offered his arm. They stood together, facing Richard Wallace. I cannot express how deeply sorry I am," Richard stammered. "Mrs. Carter, if I had only known." Grace held up her hand, stopping him. "Mr. Wallace," she said softly but firmly, "you didn't need to know my name to treat me with respect. And that," she added, glancing around at the watching crowd, "is the real issue here." There was no anger in her voice. Just clarity. Grace wasn't here for revenge. She was here for accountability. As she and Jonathan stepped onto the red carpet, moving toward the resort entrance, the world watched in silence, not because of wealth or status, but because of something far more powerful. Grace Carter had returned with the truth, and with it, the grace to make it unforgettable. Inside the resort's private VIP lounge, the air was thick with tension. Richard Wallace stood rigidly across from Jonathan and Grace Carter, his earlier arrogance replaced by a pale, drawn expression. He looked like a man bracing for the worst, and he wasn't far off the mark. Jonathan remained quiet, his arms folded across his chest. It was Grace who stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "Mr. Wallace," she began, "do you know what it's like to be judged before you've spoken a word? To be overlooked simply because you don't fit someone's image of what power should look like." Richard opened his mouth, but Grace didn't give him the chance to interrupt. "I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My father was a mechanic. My mother waited tables. I put myself through school by working 3 jobs. I started the Carter Foundation in the basement of my grandmother's house, with $5,000 and a belief that underserved children deserve opportunity." Richard blinked, the weight of her words beginning to land. "I've walked into many rooms where people didn't expect much of me," she continued. "But I never let that define who I was. What you did today wasn't just disrespectful to me, it was an insult to every woman, every person of color, and every guest who doesn't wear their wealth on their sleeve." Jonathan finally spoke, his tone firm but controlled. "You were willing to throw my wife out without asking a single real question. That tells me all I need to know about how you run this place." Richard's shoulders slumped. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, I'm deeply sorry. I let my assumptions get in the way of my judgment." Grace gave a slow nod. "I don't want you fired, Mr. Wallace. That would be easy. But I do want you to learn something from this." His eyes lifted, surprised. "Our foundation runs a mentorship program for underserved high school students interested in hospitality careers. I'd like you to commit to 1 year as a volunteer. You'll meet with students, guide them, and maybe, Just maybe, learn to see them for who they are, not what they wear. Richard hesitated, then nodded quickly. Yes, absolutely. I'd be honored. And one more thing, Grace added. Tonight's gala will now include a special pledge, a scholarship fund for hospitality students from low-income communities. The Ocean View Peninsula will sponsor the first year. Jonathan raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. This was Grace's moment. Richard swallowed hard. Understood. I'll contact the finance office right away. Grace stepped back, her work done. As she and Jonathan left the lounge, Jonathan gently took her hand. You could have crushed him, he said. I wasn't here to crush anyone, she replied. I was here to lift the right people and remind the rest what real class looks like. The ballroom shimmered with warm candlelight and quiet elegance. Guests mingled beneath chandeliers, sipping champagne and admiring the auction items displayed along the velvet-draped walls. But as the string quartet fell silent and the lights dimmed slightly, all attention turned to the stage at the center of the room. Grace Carter stepped forward. She wasn't introduced with pomp or flash. There was no dramatic music or elaborate title read aloud. She simply walked to the microphone, her cream-colored gown catching the light, and let the room settle. Good evening, she began, her voice steady and sincere. Thank you all for being here tonight in support of the Carter Foundation. When we began this journey, we had one goal, to make opportunity available to those who might never receive it otherwise. Applause rippled through the room. I stand before you tonight, not just as a philanthropist or the wife of Jonathan Carter, she continued, glancing toward her husband, seated proudly in the front row. I stand here as someone who remembers what it's like to be told you don't belong here. Her words hung in the air. Earlier today, I experienced that feeling again, she said plainly, without naming names or pointing fingers. But instead of letting it embitter me, I chose to let it become a teaching moment for everyone involved. She paused, letting the room reflect. That's why, tonight, we're launching a new scholarship fund, one that will provide full tuition to students from underserved communities who want to pursue careers in hospitality. Because respect, kindness, and potential should never be tied to a price tag or a designer label. A standing ovation followed. Jonathan joined her on stage, taking her hand. His presence added weight, but it was Grace's quiet authority that filled the room. The same guests who had once judged her now stood in admiration, not for her wealth, but for her character. After the event, guests lingered longer than usual. Some approached Grace with gratitude, others with quiet apologies, and many with stories of their own, moments they, too, had been dismissed or underestimated. The night had become more than a fundraiser. It had become a mirror. Outside, the ocean breeze cooled the evening air. Grace and Jonathan stood near the edge of the terrace, watching the lights of the Odyssey reflect in the water. You didn't just change a policy today, Jonathan said, you changed people. Grace smiled gently. That was the point. Real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from understanding. He leaned in, brushing a kiss on her cheek. Still, that entrance on the yacht? That was pretty incredible. She laughed softly. A little drama never hurts. As they stood in the night's quiet, wrapped in the scent of salt air and jasmine, Grace Carter knew this wasn't just a victory, it was a reminder. That even in a world obsessed with image, grace, humility, and integrity would always shine the brightest. Grace Carter's story is more than a tale of mistaken identity, it's a powerful reminder that dignity, humility, and character always outshine status and appearance. At its core, her experience teaches us that the way we treat others, especially those who seem ordinary, reveals more about our own values than theirs. For older adults, many of whom have witnessed a lifetime of changes in society, Grace's story is a call to reflection. It challenges us to ask, have we ever made assumptions about someone based on how they looked or what they wore? Have we ever been on the receiving end of such treatment ourselves? Grace's response wasn't loud or vengeful. Instead, it was thoughtful and purposeful. She used her influence not to shame, but to educate. She turned a personal insult into a public act of inspiration, offering mentorship and scholarships rather than condemnation. That level of emotional maturity and wisdom is something we can all aspire to. As we age, our legacy becomes less about what we own and more about the example we set. Grace chose to set an example of compassion paired with accountability. She reminded everyone in the room, young and old, that real power doesn't need to boast. It arrives quietly, with integrity, and leaves a lasting impression. In a world that often celebrates noise and image, her story encourages us to lead with kindness, act with purpose, and remember that the most meaningful impact often comes not from what we say, but how we live.